So we're starting to wind down here. Yay! So we looked at individual differences and how they affect our intimate relationships. We looked at sex, gender, personality, and the last individual difference we're going to look at is self-esteem. Self-esteem is important. It's really important in regards to our intimate relationships. How you feel about yourself, how you view yourself, is going to affect the relationships that you have with other people. Of course it is. You know, when I was going to school, meaning like elementary school and high school, this was simply not given the attention it is today. I kind of feel like we as a whole are so used to it that we now ignore a lot of what is said because so much emphasis is put on self-esteem. But how you feel about yourself, how you judge yourself, is really important regarding how it affects your relationships. Of course, if you feel good about yourself, you're going to be a happier person. That's not something that needs to be pointed out. And if you don't view yourself very positively, then you won't. Well, it's going to affect how you interact with people. So then the question is, how does high or low self-esteem affect the relationships you have or could have? Well, a sociometer is something that is used to measure the quality of our relationships with others. And it's a theory of self-esteem that says self-esteem is a kind of gauge of our relationships. So it isn't an actual thing, it's a theory, sociometer theory. This was first introduced in 1995 by Dr. Mark Leary, who is a professor of psychology and neuroscience at Duke University. And what the sociometer theory says is that our self-esteem is an instrument to measure the quality of our current and future relationships. When we don't feel like we belong or do not feel like we are appreciated by others or do not feel like others are interested in us, our self-esteem declines. When we feel like we do belong and we are accepted by others and that others are interested in us, our self-esteem rises. So basically what he's saying is your self-esteem is a reflection of your relationships. Now, of course, this makes sense in a way, but we are specifically looking at self-esteem in regard to interpersonal relationships and the effect it can have. So it isn't just the fact that how we think about ourselves becomes more positive or negative. It's that how we think about ourselves is viewed as a measure of how people feel they are valued or not valued in relationships. Our self-esteem is viewed as a measure of how people feel socially accepted by others. So the theory says that when people do things that appear intended to protect or increase their self-esteem, it isn't really to make themselves feel better. Instead, the goal is really to protect their relational value and to enhance it, thus increasing the likelihood of interpersonal acceptance. And when our self-esteem declines in some way or goes down, that is more likely to happen as a result of a rejection. When we feel we've been personally rejected by somebody, that's going to have an effect on how we think about ourselves. And if we've been rejected publicly, then the effect is going to be even stronger. So how we evaluate ourselves is directly affected by what we think others think of us. This is nothing new. But the sociometer theory says our self-esteem is more than just how we feel about ourselves. It's actually more specifically based on our need to belong, on our perceived ability to belong and not be rejected. And this may seem like we're splitting hairs, but it isn't. These are actually two different things. And this is going to affect, as I've said, your close personal relationships, your intimate relationships. So we've looked at the influence of culture, how that affects the evolution of relationships, experience, individual differences, and I'm pretty sure this is the last one, is human nature. So what does this term, human nature, refer to? This refers to the evolutionary influences that have shaped our relationship over the course of history. And at this point, there are certain tendencies that are really human tendencies. Simply by virtue of being human, you have these tendencies. We all have certain predispositions, certain inclinations, just because we're human beings. And this is all based in evolutionary psychology, which looks at how our psychological structures have evolved. So again, just like animals may have certain physical traits that have emerged over time as a result of evolution, evolutionary psychology examines our psychological growth that has occurred because of evolution over time. So for example, an evolutionist psychologist would say that there's certain behaviors and traits that occur in human beings in all cultures. Doesn't matter what the society is, doesn't matter what their culture is, just because they're human, they're going to have these traits. Things like preferring healthier mates, things like being able to interpret the emotions or reactions from others. And evolutionary psychology identifies sexual selection as an example of psychological evolution. So, polar bears evolved to have thick fur that keeps them warm and repels water. Human beings have evolved psychologically to be more successful in reproducing. And a necessary part of being successful in reproducing is belonging and not being rejected, not feeling rejected to give you a reproductive advantage. Over hundreds of years, this need to belong and not be rejected in order to reproduce grew and evolved. So as a very simple and somewhat silly example, let's imagine there's a caveman and a cavewoman, and they're really antisocial people. Well, over time, that antisocial trait became smaller and smaller, and the need to belong and not be antisocial became bigger and more dominant. That antisocial trait was essentially bred out of human beings as we evolved. The need to be with others increased until eventually it's completely dominant. Human beings have evolved to be as successful as possible at reproduction, at sexual selection. Now, the second point regarding human nature is probably a very different point from what you have typically viewed. So let me explain it. Evolutionary psychology says that men and women should only have differences from each other in regard to the different reproductive problems they faced, historically speaking. Otherwise, they should be very similar in their intimate relationships. So what the heck does that mean? Well, luckily your text provides some very clear examples of this in relation to parental investment and paternity uncertainty. So, what does parental investment mean? Especially these days in our modern society, when it comes to investing time and energy in children, in Canada at least, that has evened out quite a bit. But this idea of parental investment refers to a lot more, as the example in the text states. In as polite a way as possible, a man's involvement in procreation is pretty simple. He has sex, and it's done. For a woman, however, she has about 9 months more to put in. That's her role in reproduction. And so a woman has to put in more time and more energy, and yes, I'm going to say it, sacrifice more than a man in order to reproduce. There is no way to change this. Biologically, the female body is made to carry children and the male body is not, so there's nothing we can do about it. Now, years ago, there was a movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger where he was a scientist who agrees to be the first man to become pregnant because of some experimental drug. The movie was called Junior, but that's just what it was. It was the movies. For a woman, it doesn't matter how many times she is sexually active during that time. She can only be impregnated once. And if you're pregnant, you can't have sex again a month later and you're going to be pregnant again. She can't be re-impregnated with another baby when she's already pregnant. So that is one way parental investment will affect our intimate relationships, according to evolutionary psychology. The time and the effort. Another way it can affect our intimate relationships is our personal resources. And what I mean is that women have much more limited resources when it comes to reproduction. A woman can only become pregnant when she is not already pregnant. So for several months of a year, her womb is off the market, so to speak, if she's pregnant. But a man can continue to impregnate somebody on a daily basis. He can do it more than once a day if he wanted to. So men have more reproductive resources available to them, and they can reproduce more than women. In addition, eventually every woman will go through menopause and lose the ability to have children. Physically, she will no longer be able to do it. Men have women beat in this regard as well because there's no age limit on them. Charlie Chaplin very famously fathered a child in his 70s. But for the vast majority of women, by their mid-50s, menopause has set in and they can no longer become pregnant. So according to evolutionary psychology, this accounts for at least part of the reason that women are more careful in how they choose their romantic partners, and why women are less okay with casual sexual experiences than men. It has been identified as one of the differences in sex selection. Another sex selection issue in regard to human nature is paternity. Paternity uncertainty, meaning that a man can sometimes never be 100% sure a child is his, and it is because of this that women will be unfaithful less than men, but men will still worry more about a female partner. Okay, so I'm going to repeat that because it's a lot of information. What this is saying, paternity uncertainty, is that we can identify patterns of behavior in all of humanity regarding sex selection that are simply part of human nature. And when we look at paternity uncertainty, you know, I'm trying to think how to put this in a nice, polite way. If a woman's pregnant, she's pregnant. There's no confusion about who the mother is in that relationship, who the female partner is. But because she can be impregnated by anybody, you can never be 100% sure who the father is, at least according to evolutionary psychology. All around the world, both men and women, for example, look for different things in an intimate relationship, depending on if they're looking for a short-term relationship, which would include a short fling, compared to if they're looking for a long-term relationship. So all of this has to do with that. Now, here we go, the very last thing we're going to discuss in this chapter. Keep in mind, all of these are things that influence the evolution of relationships, things that influence close personal relationships. And the last is interaction. This is the last influence on intimate relationships. And this is going to sound really, really, really hokey, which I personally dislike because I am the total opposite of being a hokey person. But a relationship does consist of give and take. A relationship, by definition, requires more than one person. And because of this, a relationship is going to be affected by everything we have reviewed in this chapter in regards to you, as well as everything we've reviewed in this chapter in regards to the other person. Everything from both of you will affect your relationship, which is also why your relationships with different people, whether they're romantic relationships or friendships, can be so dramatically different. At the exact same point in time in the same place, you can have dramatically different friendships with different people, with different siblings, maybe with each one of your parents. It's like you have dinner with a bunch of people over the course of a week, and every night you have a potluck dinner with somebody else. So every night, whoever it is that comes to your house brings something different to the table. You don't know what they're going to bring. You have no control over what they're going to bring, but they show up with whatever their dish is. If this arrangement happened over and over, then sure, eventually you get an idea of what they're likely to bring. Just like in a relationship over time, you get an idea of what you can expect from that person. But that interaction is always a two-way street. And in my head, I'm thinking of, fights you used to see with couples in these hokey TV movies where one person would feel like the other one wasn't completely invested in a relationship, and they're yelling saying, it takes two to be in this relationship. Well, yes, it does. Okay, summary. Relationships are really constructed from a variety of influences. Other than the genetic component, every facet, every behavior, every thought, every attitude, every tendency that you have in your intimate relationships, whether romantic or friendships or with your family or whoever, All of that can be relearned. Nothing is set in stone. Things can always shift, but you have to want to shift them. Maybe the manner with which you conduct yourselves in a relationship changes and you haven't even realized it until after the fact. So it wasn't purposeful. And maybe that change resulted in something positive, maybe it resulted in something negative. We don't know. But change is possible. I want you to just generally be aware of all of the influences that affect a close personal relationship. And remember, as I said, it's not just affecting what you bring to the relationship, but you have all of this concerning every other person you have a relationship with. And combined, it's what has affected you and what has affected them that determines the course of the relationship.